So thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and to experience Selwyn College and Cambridge during what I'm sure is typical weather for all of you. It's always a pleasure for an American to visit the mother country, and I enjoy coming from my Cambridge to the other, and I have to admit, original Cambridge. And it's also an honor to deliver a lecture that has addressed many important topics over the years and has been delivered by an array of distinguished predecessors. What I want to do today is to address the Obama presidency, which is drawing to its close in the United States. And I do that not as a biographer. I'm not a biographer. I'm not going to be able to make all kinds of scintillating quotes that you haven't heard before. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm not even a narrative historian, so I won't be able to provide some of the kind of wonderful detail that many of you might enjoy, and I'm sure I would enjoy too if I knew it. I speak as a political scientist who, from the start of the Obama presidency, has seen this particular presidency as an interesting pivotal instance in modern American politics, because it is a presidency, the president himself and his party, trying to shift the direction of a very cumbersome governmental system that is hard to shift under the best of circumstances. And the story in this case is unfolded under unusually contentious political circumstances. So that's the kind of reflection that I'm going to offer on a moment in U.S. political history when a change-oriented president comes to power, at a time when U.S. economic and military hegemony in the world faces the need for fundamental readjustments, when international challenges take new forms, such as the need to address global climate change, when U.S. society and the economy are rapidly changing, and when many wonder if a 200-year-old constitutional democracy, I realize that, by British standards this is nothing, but 200-year-old constitutional democracy can face the challenges that lie ahead. All of that was clearly on the minds of Barack Obama when he bid for the presidency in 2007 and 2008. And I'd like to share some reflections today with you on how the Obama presidency has both reflected and handled these shifting conditions and challenges. Now, the poster for today's session, and I'm very pleased that it's up there, does a nice job of framing a central reality that any analyst must face in assessing this presidency right now. It's not over yet, and it's always better to explain things after they're over. So I face the challenge of addressing what we see in the poster. We see a very sober President Obama who might well be contemplating his legacy and what it's going to turn out to be. His hair is a little less gray than I think it actually is after 7 years in the White House and in Washington, D.C. He's flanked by vaguer pictures on his left of the now, we know, 2016 Democratic presidential contender, Hillary Rodham Clinton, who embodies the mainstream Democratic Party synthesis of Clinton and Obama accomplishments and the hopes for their continuation and extension in the next period. Hillary Clinton, as we all know, has won the right to build on the Obama legacy by surviving a populist left primary challenger, Bernie Sanders, who has been, in recent years, a leading critic of Obama for not, he says, achieving all the progressive political and policy changes he supposedly could have achieved. On Obama's right in the poster is a looming picture of Donald Trump. The blustery reality TV real estate mogul, I have trouble saying this, but who has won the GOP ticket to challenge for the presidency in 2016, a truly remarkable development in American political history. Now, Trump, as we know, was the leader of many right populist efforts to delegitimize the Obama presidency. For example, by touting the so-called claim that Obama was not a native-born American and therefore not a legitimate president of the United States. And he has risen to the nomination, the presumptive nomination of the Republican Party, by working his way through deep fissures that have appeared, particularly between elites and populist-minded voters in the Republican Party during the 8 years of the Obama presidency. So the poster nicely reminds us that we cannot really pin down the Obama impact just yet, because so much depends in assessing any presidency, or for that matter, any leadership episode in any polity at any time in human history, on what follows. In the US case, our polity and our society are both deeply polarized, and we cannot be sure whether Obama's achievements will have set new directions that continue after his departure, or will have sparked a profound reaction and rollback that will undo some, but I think not all, of his accomplishments. So that's the moment on which I'm delivering this lecture, and we'll just make the best of it. I'm going to search for an interim assessment. Now, what yardsticks would we use in thinking about the possible impact of the Obama presidency? One possibility takes us back to the truly euphoric and somewhat unifying moment that occurred November 5th, 2008, when Obama won the presidency by a decisive margin, particularly for a Democrat in the current period, and there were massive, joyous crowds in Grant Park in Chicago with civil rights leaders and people who had worked their whole life for racial change, and as well as democratic politics, with tears in their eyes and with a gracious message from the losing Republican John McCain, who pointed to the pride that all Americans could have in what really, I think, frankly, was a surprising moment, that a man named Barack Hussein Obama, an African American of partially African descent, could be president of the United States, could be elected president. And that moment, that pride lasted across partisan lines for some weeks into the Obama presidency. Before Obama actually was inaugurated in late 2008, the cover of Time magazine celebrated the most hopeful possibilities that seemed to have been unleashed that night by suggesting that Barack Obama, who was portrayed on the cover as if he were a black Franklin Delano Roosevelt, riding in an open convertible with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, President Obama, backed by Democratic majorities which had just been elected to the House and Senate, thereby giving him a parliamentary-like possibility to act, which is rather unusual in American politics. The possibility that a New Deal, as they put it on the cover of Time magazine, could bring about a mutually reinforcing redirection of federal government policies and activities domestically and in the world, and an electoral realignment at the same time that would ensconce Democrats in power for perhaps many elections to come. Now, this model, this New Deal model, yardstick against which we might look back and measure the Obama presidency, suggests that we look for the possibility that major policy shifts were accomplished that fed into supportive electoral changes, which in turn further reinforce the new governing directions. In this case, we would be looking to see whether governing shifts in the direction of building a more bottom-up and middle-class-oriented economy and a more cooperative international role for the United States were brought about, and whether they brought political rewards for the party of the president that helped to propel them. So that's one yardstick, the New Deal yardstick. A second yardstick however, was articulated by Obama himself before he won the presidential nomination in 2008, during the 2008 Democratic presidential primaries, when he stated his aspiration, which he's repeated in similar terms many times since, not so much to be a new Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but to be a Democratic version of the late 20th century Republican president Ronald Reagan. Here's what Obama said to the Reno Gazette-Journal about this. Quote, "I don't want to present myself as some sort of singular figure. I think part of what's different are the times. I do think that, for example, the 1980 election was different. I think Ronald Reagan changed the trajectory of America in a way that Richard Nixon did not, and in a way that," here he takes a swipe, "Bill Clinton did not. He, that is Ronald Reagan, put us on a fundamentally different path because the country was ready for it." So this model is, this yardstick would be to measure the degree to which Obama fulfilled his own aspiration to be a kind of new pathfinder, a door opener that would not so much accomplish a New Deal, but put America on a new course, broadly supported, and certainly shift the direction of governance and politics from directions that had been in place from Reagan through the Bush Jr. Presidency that preceded him. We can weigh Obama's presidency against both of these yardsticks, and that's what I propose to do, and see that he has almost certainly registered accomplishments in both that go partway toward fulfilling both visions of change. But he has not fully achieved either vision. And to see why that's true, we have to probe both policy shifts and political changes and their mutual interrelations. And we have to actually go beyond Obama and the Democrats themselves to look at what happened with Republicans and conservatism in the United States during the Obama era of the last 8 years. I'm going to do this in 3 steps. First, I'll address why Obama's presidency has accomplished policy changes, but not the political reinforcement that would be expected if it were really a full New Deal. He's kind of done a halfway New Deal. And then I'm going to talk about why U.S. conservatism and the Republican Party have moved to extraordinary extremes during this period as they fought against and sought to obstruct the accomplishments and aspirations of the Obama presidency. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about how Obama has indeed achieved a possible Reagan-like trajectory shift. I think in many ways he has probably achieved what he set out to achieve, but certainly not in the ways he imagined, and the issue is not yet settled. Now, I'm not going to go through a lot of empirical data in this lecture, but I want to assure you this is based on a lot of empirical research. In the first 2 years of the Obama presidency, I assembled a whole team of political scientists and political sociologists to analyze the policy changes as they were happening in a whole series of spheres: immigration policy, environmental policy, labor policy, education policy, healthcare, taxes, and to see how much was accomplished, whether it was accomplished through administrative action, legislative action, the use of the bully pulpit. These are the 3 major ways in which American presidents can act, and what kinds of response the attempts to bring about policy changes in all those areas met, not just from Republicans, but from Democrats in the Congress, because in the US system, the people in Congress often don't go along, even with presidents in their own party, and what responses they received from the public and broader interest groups. So that empirical basis for the first 2 years, in many ways, some of us have carried forward by tracking those policy changes in those areas through the full 7 years. In addition, I've done original research on the Tea Party explosions that emerged, and I'll talk about them briefly, in the first 2 years of Obama's presidency. And most recently, I'm working with a team of collaborators to look at the reorganizations on the right and left in U.S. national politics that have come to new culminations during the 8 years of the Obama presidency. So that's what I'm drawing on. Now let me start by talking about why, against the New Deal yardstick or aspiration, at best the Obama presidency has achieved a halfway New Deal. I think it's arguable, and I'm going to argue, I'm sure there are dissenters in the audience, and we'll hear from them in due course, that on the policy side, the achievements of the Obama presidency really do add up to a remarkable series of legislative and regulatory accomplishments. Let me just mention some of them on the domestic and foreign side. On the domestic side, coming into office at a moment when the financial system was collapsing, the early Obama administration bailed out the auto industry and saved a great deal of economic activity in the American Midwest, and engineered a major stimulus program that certainly exceeded what European countries were able to do in that period, that set the United States on an insufficiently quick but definitely steady road to economic recovery and growth, which continues to this day and lays the basis for Obama's claim to be a successful president. Because even though presidents don't really control all these economic things, they're measured against them. So that's number one. Obama also promised from the start that he would shift taxes in the United States. Never an easy thing to do because it requires cooperation from Congress, in the direction of easing the tax burden on low and middle income people and slightly increasing it on the rich. And he has ultimately accomplished all of those things. Not very much on the rich, but as much as he could squeeze out of Mitch McConnell and John Boehner at a moment of potential economic stasis or government stasis. The most important accomplishment on the domestic front is the most redistributive or equality-enhancing policy to be enacted in the United States in the past half century. That's the Affordable Care Act, which I have studied in some detail and I'm still studying because the implementation is just as important as the enactment. This is a law that, to put it briefly, taxes the rich and business to provide affordable health insurance coverage to now 20 million and eventually up to 30 million citizens who are mainly low-income people who are not ordinarily in a position to benefit from public policy changes. That accomplishment alone marks Obama as one of the major modern era US presidents, that he presided over that and stuck with it until it was accomplished. He presided over the enactment of re-regulation of the financial sector and the establishment of a consumer protection agency that Wall Street is still trying to dismantle, but it's still there. He spurred changes in the college loan system in the United States to take out businesses and banks as profit-making subsidized middlemen and to deliver more financial aid to low-income students. All those legislative accomplishments were pretty much in place in the first 2 years, for 6 months of which the Obama administration enjoyed a 60-vote margin when Joe Lieberman cooperated in the Senate, and as well as majorities in the House. The rest of the accomplishments I'm going to tick off here are much more through executive action, because that's all that's been available since 2011. Cap and trade legislation, by the way, failed in the United States in 2010. That's the most visible attempt that failed in those early 2 years. But even in the first 2 years, the Obama administration was engineering major investments in clean energy, and Obama has pursued with increasing firmness as he moves toward the end of his presidency a series of executive actions through the Environmental Protection Agency and other presidential orders to change the incentives, reduce subsidies and encouragements for dirty energy, and increase the incentives for businesses and states to use and produce clean energy. That he has done the same in the area of immigration legislation, where attempts to enact comprehensive immigration reforms that included a path to citizenship for some 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States could not get through Congress, but twice President Obama has used executive actions to shift the focus of immigration enforcement toward removing recent border crossers and criminals, and to protect children and families that are living in communities across the heartlands of America from the threat of immediate deportation. And finally, pro-union reforms failed, and by the way, failed not because of Republican obstruction, but because of Democratic obstruction as well. But the Obama Labor Department has issued one after another in the way of new rules or efforts to enforce health and safety measures, measures against wage theft, measures that speed up union elections, and give some kinds of protections to home health care workers and undocumented workers who are among the most vulnerable in the American labor system. Now, on the foreign policy front, Obama promised originally, in fact, rose to the nomination for the presidency by promising to withdraw the United States from the disastrous Iraq war. And he did, which should not be minimized because there was no treaty signing on a carrier anywhere. It just had to happen through presidential commander-in-chief decision. He also promised early on to intensify the interventions in Afghanistan and then pull back, and that's what he did too. I think many liberals in the United States think he promised to be a pacifist. Well, no, he didn't. If you go back and look at what he promised when he ran for office, it was a form of muscular but cautious international realism that he proposed to reinstitute in the United States. And in many ways, he carried through on that, including a promise to intensify counterterror and anti-insurgency operations rather than conducting more massive invasions to remake entire regions of the world. At the same time, he opened the door to more international cooperation on climate change efforts, and in just the last year has accomplished remarkable openings, much contested in the US political system, to Cuba and support for the treaty with Iran in the face of almost unremitting opposition. So I would say, and I've ticked off a lot of things, I probably missed some, this is a record that on the policy side measures up very, very well to any other president for many decades, and probably would get you at least into the New Deal territory if you thought it through. But obviously, these policy accomplishments have not been accompanied by political transformations or payoffs for the Democratic Party in any straightforward or mutually reinforcing way. In fact, from the very opening days of his presidency, Obama faced, I think much to his surprise in the midst of an economic meltdown, nearly total opposition from Republicans in Congress. And we learned later that the Republican leaders, Mitch McConnell, John Boehner, and others, plotted from the night of the inauguration to do everything possible to block initiatives so that they would not be partners in anything that would result in a successful and quick economic recovery that President Obama could take credit for. And then in 2010 and again in 2014, Democrats experienced massive losses In state elections, Republicans, very conservative Republicans, now control about 2/3 of American states. And of course, they now control both the House of Representatives and the Senate of the United States. These are not just a failure to get political payoffs. These are political boomerangs of a very serious nature, especially because in the US political system, a lot of federal policy initiatives, such as the health care law, depend on states for their full implementation. Why did this happen? Really, there was only about a 6-month period between the time that Senator Al Franken was finally seated in the summer of 2009 and before Scott Brown was elected as a Republican to substitute the late Senator Kennedy in early 2010. There was only about 6 months in there where Obama actually had a Congress that perhaps he could persuade to enact legislative proposals. Why did he face such unremitting opposition, and why was that opposition so successful? Well, I'm not going to go into all the reasons, but I've elsewhere mentioned a variety of them that I think come into clearer focus when you think about the conditions that existed back at the time of the first New Deal and compare them to the conditions, social, ideological, political, that existed when Obama came to office. Let me just tick these off quickly. One thing that was very, very important was that Obama came to office just as an economic crisis was unfolding, just at the beginning. Whereas FDR in the 30s came to office at the depths of an economic crisis. That made it a lot easier in the 1930s to do something that Obama and his allies failed to do in 2009 and 10, which is to launch a massive jobs creation program, including public works. And Obama has recently said, correctly so, that the failure to be able to do that was one of his big regrets about what happened in response to the 2008-2009 financial crisis. It was just getting going. Most Americans did not understand the depths to which our economy and the world's economy were headed. And Barack Obama and his quickly appointed economic team, which was mainly borrowed from the Clinton era and from Wall Street Democrats, acted mainly to staunch the decline of the financial sector and to push through spending of any kind they could into quick channels. That was a major achievement given total Republican obstruction. Close to $1 trillion was spent on economic stimulus, and we know that it did staunch the decline and set the US economy, and in many ways the world economy, onto a road to recovery. But it was also a missed opportunity because Obama was not, I would argue, in a position to appeal to all political actors and to the American citizenry as a whole for a much more major investment in job creation at that critical moment when it might have made a big difference, particularly in how the American public ended up perceiving the bailouts and the recovery proposals. Instead, although the recovery proposals worked, many Americans saw them as giveaways to privileged and existing interests, and in many ways they were in the emergency moment. So it's better, if you're going to come to power in an economic crisis aiming to redirect government, to come to power at the depths of that crisis rather than at the beginning. Obama ended up holding hands with the equivalent of Herbert Hoover, something that FDR very carefully avoided. Other things that, shall we say, expanded or empowered the opposition or the public disillusionment while undercutting potential support would be the much closer alignment of partisanship and ideology in the current American political system. Back in the 30s, Republicans and Democrats and conservatives and liberals did not line up perfectly. Now they do. And what that means is that Republicans were in an empowered position to pose an ideologically consistent and loud critique from the first moment that tapped into Americans' longstanding uneasiness about strong government action. Obama faced the usual difficulties that any majority president faces with their co-partisans in Congress. He couldn't always corral all the Democrats. I'll skip that except to say that that was a very important factor in the failure of cap and trade. It wasn't just Republican opposition, but the opposition of coal state Democrats and moderate Democrats that undercut that. And tax policies and health care policy had to be compromised with moderate Democrats, which people who still existed in the US Congress at that point. They don't anymore. They've been replaced by much more extreme conservatives in the Republican Party. The media context is one that made it very difficult for Obama to do something that I don't think he did very well anyway, which is explain the steps that were being taken for an economic recovery. The US media context is fragmented. There is no equivalent of the BBC in the United States. And it is a series of economically stressed outlets that are looking for controversy, coexisting with Fox News, which is a behemoth able to convey conservative propaganda almost at will. That's a simple, but it's empirically accurate. I can defend it. That, to say the very least, tends to undercut existing office holders who are trying to get a message across to the citizenry. And the final factor I would point to is that Obama's attempt to redirect American government, and particularly domestic social and tax policies, occurred against the backdrop of a forest of inherited policies that grew up in the late 20th century since the New Deal in the United States. The U.S. federal government has not been a small affair for a long time, and it has expanded both under Republicans and under Democrats, no matter what the political rhetoric says. But a lot of that expansion has taken the form of creating tax breaks and tax credits for all kinds of special interests or private interests or rich people. And our healthcare system consists of a series of public subsidies and tax credits and tax breaks, very bewildering in its interaction with private insurance and public programs. At the time that Obama came to office, our college loan system included lots of private middlemen who were receiving subsidized profits for delivering loans that could be delivered much more economically or efficiently through government. So Obama's attempt to redirect a public policy in the direction of that would benefit middle income and low income people and deliver fewer goodies, fewer benefits to the very top, basically unfolded in that context. And he proposed a series of very complex redirections that inherently aroused suspicion of the citizenry as they passed through the American Congress. Healthcare reform is a good example. The things that were being adjusted in the tax code and the regulatory system and subsidies would be hardly visible at all to the people who were going to benefit from them after they were enacted, but very clear to the business interests, private interests, some of them liberal, by the way. American universities, including my own university, Harvard, were at the forefront in opposing some of the changes in the charitable tax deduction that would have helped to finance the Affordable Care Act. I mean, Harvard is a charity. We need the help. So privileged interests and as well as right ideological interests were very clear about the stakes and easy to oppose everything move that was made, but the potential beneficiaries were confused or ignorant of the benefits that might be achieved. And the Affordable Care Act, the health reform law, is a prime example of this. It was incredibly complex. The compromises required to get it through the US Congress included things that could be pilloried and ridiculed very easily. And it wasn't even going to go into full effect for 3 more years. So most Americans to this day if they're asked by pollsters about the various things that the healthcare law has actually delivered, say that they approve of them by large bipartisan majorities, but most Americans also to this day don't know those things are in the Obamacare law. So the challenge of redirecting a complex and hidden set of established government programs is very different from creating them in the first place in the 1930s. Now, my bottom line on the New Deal yardstick is that Obama made some wrong moves along the way. We can talk about those in the question period. But I believe that on the whole, he achieved a remarkable amount. He and his Democratic allies achieved a remarkable amount of policy change in the directions that had been promised in the face of unremitting opposition. And so I'd like to move on to that unremitting opposition, because I come from a profession, political science, that has had models for quite some time that predicts that when parties lose, they will move to the middle. They will moderate. This is the median voter theory, and it's a religious faith in political science, and it's a religious faith to which most of my colleagues still adhere. And like the medieval solar system maps, they find ways to fit any new squiggle into this model. So I'm not here to speak for the entire American political science profession, but I am here to speak the truth. I come from a university whose motto is Veritas. I take that very seriously. And the truth is that the Republican Party, which had already moved to the very hard right on economic issues between 1980 and 2000, has galloped yet further and ever further to the nether right, particularly on economic issues, ever since. And it continued to do so even after Democrats scored major victories in the late Bush administration, in the 2008 election, and even in face of reports by its own intellectuals that point to the changing electoral and demographic realities in the United States that make many of the courses of action quite unpopular. So we can't understand the Obama era unless we understand why this movement toward right-wing extremism, particularly again on economic and redistributive issues, has continued apace in the US Republican Party. And I'm not going to be able to convey all that I'd like to about this. This is actually what I get really excited to study. Republicans are where all the action is these days in the United States. But the first phase of this was the outbreak of the Tea Party phenomenon, which happened a few weeks after Obama moved into the White House and featured, I understand there's a British equivalent to this, and I don't know how this quite works, but in America it featured older white people carrying signs denouncing Obama's mortgage policies and healthcare policies as the equivalent of Nazism and Stalinism, dressed up as American colonists. The type who threw, tea into the harbor against the British. And I don't know how the British Tea Party adapts that. I'd love to know. But in the American case, this was very resonant. And the Tea Party also, of course, included a whole series of media operations, the entire right-wing media complex, and long-standing billionaire-backed funding organizations and ultra-free market advocacy groups that jumped on the bandwagon and said, yes, we too are the Tea Party. The research I did with Vanessa Williamson explored both parts of this and how they interacted. But I would say the most fascinating part of our research was when we went out and talked to grassroots Tea Party protesters and observed some of their local Tea Party meetings. 900 local Tea Parties across the United States were organized by these Tea Partiers in 2010 and 11, and that's a remarkable accomplishment. They meet regularly, and many of them are still meeting, although not as many. We were particularly interested in what they were all riled up about. Now, at the elite level, it's very clear. They were declaring that the protesters supported their long-standing aims to privatize or cut Social Security and Medicare, to reduce regulation on businesses, to block climate change policies, the whole package. that the Koch brothers now support wholeheartedly. But when you actually went out and talked to the grassroots Tea Partiers, the older whites who made up about half of the voting ranks of the Republican Party then and still do now, their number one issue was immigration. They were angry about the changing ethnic composition of American society in an era of high immigration since 1965, and they particularly wanted a crackdown on what they perceived to be mostly illegal or undocumented immigrants. Now, in fact, they overestimate the proportion who are in the United States without documentation. And they're particularly riled up about immigrants from Central and Mexico and America and Mexico. They saw them as a threat to American society. They saw them as claimants on social welfare policies, healthcare supports, and you couldn't tell them that, in fact, they weren't eligible for most of those things in Obamacare because they were convinced that Obamacare was going to cut programs that real Americans like themselves were using, the elder entitlements, the veterans programs, in order to pay for these new benefits for these people who, as one woman put it to me, why do I have to hit a button to say I want English in my own country? Good question. So, that group of people was disproportionately white and elderly. And in the United States, white elderly people vote, especially in midterms. So the first vulnerability of the Obama presidency was that it soon faced elections in 2010 and then again later in 2014, in which the electorate was going to be skewed toward angry, very conservative voters. And the big money operations on the right of the Republican Party understood that and did all they could to stoke that opposition with racial innuendo. As a recent Saturday Night Live skit put it, they had a Mitt Romney character on. He said, "We Republicans don't say racist things, we just imply them." Actually, in the first 2 years of the Obama presidency, they said them too. Now, Obama was reelected, but he was reelected by a very different electorate. It's important to remember that in midterm elections, 2 out of 5 eligible voters vote in America. In recent presidential years, and perhaps it'll be true again in 2016, it's more like 3 out of 5 eligible voters. So the electorates are very different in these periods. These realities enabled and provoked extremism in the Republican Party. Both the pressures from below, from the very attentive and frightened and angry conservative populist voters in and around the Republican Party, who are very assiduous participants in primary elections and who keep an eye on their elected office holders after they're elected, and the pressures from what we call the roving billionaires who are pressing the free market extremes. Both sets of forces worked like a pincers movement on the Republican Party and caused elected office holders and candidates for office to refuse any modicum of compromise with Obama. And it pushed the Republican Party very far to the right, particularly, yes, opposition to immigration reform, but also on a whole series of economic issues, such as advocacy for cuts in Social Security and Medicare, proposals for ever more generous tax redistributions toward the already very affluent top of the American society, economic policies that are actually unpopular, even with many Republicans. Flash forward 5 years later to where we are now, and I would argue that that extremism, particularly the elite brand of extremism, that pulled so many Republicans toward extreme economic measures, redistributive toward the top, in an era where middle income and lower income Americans are struggling economically, opened the door wide open for a candidate who could put together what the mass base of the Republican Party really wants, which is immigrant bashing combined with protection of social provision for the native population and at least a gesture in the direction of helping people who feel they've been beat down by trade agreements or recent economic trends following the Great Recession. So the story of Republican extremism is both a story of the roots of refusal to compromise with and determination to use all means possible to obstruct the Obama agenda, which has prevented much more policy change from happening than might have happened if there had been even a modicum of compromise, and which slowed down a lot of the achievements that were made in the first 2 years. But it also planted the seeds for the breakup of the Republican Party coalition, as increasingly the elite and populist forces that labeled themselves Tea Party together in the early period have come apart, particularly in Republican presidential contests. In 2012, the populist opponents looked very hard for a non-Romney to nominate. They just didn't find one. This time around, the perfect non-Romney, the kick-ass guy, captured 40% of the Republican imagination and electorate last summer, and he never lost it after that. So, obstruction and extremism have reaped the whirlwind now as the Republican Party comes to the end of the Obama presidency, unable to field a candidate that its elites, both free market elites and party elites, can get behind as a likely victor who could roll back the Obama accomplishments. I'm not saying it won't happen, but it's less likely with Trump trumping the Republican Party. So let me now conclude by returning to the second yardstick that I articulated back at the beginning, Obama's own yardstick for himself, his stated aspiration to be a Ronald Reagan-like trajectory changer in American government and politics. The journalist David Marinas has recently written a reflection on Obama's aspirations and achievements, and he makes the following point, quote, it was not a careless slip when he, Obama, said during the 2008 campaign that he wanted to emulate Ronald Reagan. At the time, you know, there was a flurry of tut-tutting among liberals. How could he say that? It was not a careless slip, Marinas says, when he said that during the 2008 campaign that he wanted to emulate Ronald Reagan and change the trajectory of America in ways that recent presidents, including Bill Clinton, had been unable to do. Obama did not just want to be president. His mission was to leave a legacy as a president of consequence, the liberal counter to Reagan. Now, I would continue this observation by stressing that Obama wanted to redirect U.S. government policy and public faith to reverse the directions that Reagan had set in motion in 1980, to revalidate government social and economic policy as tools for improving opportunity and security for the middle and lower income ranks that had faced stagnation and decline since the Reagan Revolution, to revalidate what I would call a realist internationalism in a new global era of where diplomatic action would matter more than simply launching invasions of entire regions of the world, which the U.S. certainly can do anytime it wants to, but then what? And to rekindle, he aspired as well to rekindle democratic faith, I mean small d democratic faith, in government as a partial tool for achieving cooperative goals. Obama never suggested that government was the only way, just that it was an important part of Americans' aspirations to achieve cooperative goals. You can see that in his acceptance speech and his inaugural speeches. Now, in many respects, I think Obama has, so far at least, achieved especially the first and second of these goals, the redirection of public policy in the United States toward doing more for the middle and lower ranks of society, and the effort to revalidate a realist internationalism. And in fact, I think you're going to see a lot of Republican realist internationalists endorsing Hillary Clinton for president in the face of the options that are presented at this juncture. And he's at least opened the door for a rekindling of democratic faith in government as a tool for achieving cooperative goals. He has created the possibility that all three of these achievements, at least partially, can be assigned to his legacy. But there are some sharp ironies here as we head into the next big American election, and I want to point them out in closing. Obama did not achieve the trajectory change he aspired to achieve in the ways he originally intended. If you go back and read his speeches as a candidate and his acceptance speech in Denver in 2008, you'll see that he imagined, as the quotes from him about Reagan suggest, that he might be a kind of guide or midwife to a transformation that would be appealing across partisan and class lines. He wanted to be a healer of the partisan and ethnic divisions that are so sharp in American society and politics right now. That certainly did not happen. And the election that we're about to face is going to be one of the most ethnically and racially polarized, not to mention gender polarized, in all of American history. I mean, their gender polarization couldn't be before because there was no woman running for the presidency, but the whole 9 yards of polarizations are going to be in play in this election. And certainly that's not what Obama hoped for during his presidency. He's a compromiser, and he always reaches out to compromise, and it took him 6 years to figure out that nobody wanted to compromise with him. And his achievements only came in the face of unremitting partisan obstructionism and opposition, which, you know, he fairly ruthlessly and cleverly navigated his way through at various points, but he was slow to accept that he just couldn't get cooperation from imaginary moderate Republicans. And it took him until the last 2 years after the second round of midterm setbacks for Democrats to realize that he had to find ways to proceed, as he has, through executive action and in both domestic and foreign policy, without any expectation of cooperation from his political enemies or compromise. And finally, here's the final irony that, like all epoch-shifting leaders, Obama has opened the door for change. In this case, he's opened the door for 21st century Americans to walk through toward a democracy that will be more truly multi-ethnic, that will rekindle possibilities for using government on behalf of the majority rather than the wealthy, and certainly create a more constructive role for the United States in the world political economy. But all of the possibilities he's set in motion depend now for their continuation and realization on the election of the wife of the man he dissed in 2008. That would be Hillary Rodham Clinton. She has to be elected, even as a president who cannot achieve much more in the way of transformation, simply in order to preserve and continue the lines of new openings that Obama has launched. Unless she wins, Obama will turn out to be a trajectory-changing president, all right, but the trajectory will be toward nativist reaction rather than toward a more inclusive economy and multi-ethnic democracy. So the end of the story is yet to be told. Which of those two will move into the White House next? The rise of both of them has been enabled and set in motion by Obama's presidency, but only one of them will continue and deepen his achievements.